Acts chapter 25, verse 1. While you're turning there, last time we saw the conclusion of Paul's trial before the governor of Judea at that time, which was Felix. Paul finished by explaining that he had no motive to do any of the things that he was accused of by the Jews. He was simply bringing a love offering to the poor saints at Jerusalem. He wasn't stirring up the people. He wasn't in a big crowd. He wasn't found guilty of any crime before the chief captain. He wasn't found guilty of any crime before the Sanhedrin either. He did confess to stirring up a fight between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He did admit to that. He kind of played them against each other about the hope of the resurrection. And so he was lured into participating the way the world does for that brief period of time. But he does admit it, and it wasn't a crime punishable by Roman law. And so that wasn't a legitimate means for detaining him or punishing him either. And so Felix knows that Paul is innocent, but he procrastinates. He keeps putting off making any decision at all. He's trying to appease the Jews, and I believe he eventually wanted to let Paul go. But the Jews keep persisting about having Paul condemned, and they want him to die. And so Felix kept him under arrest as a personal bodyguard, a Roman centurion, and really has perfect liberty as far as guests are concerned. Anybody he wants to come and see him and minister to him can come any time there, and he continues to minister to others. He just can't leave custody there, and he does that for 2 years. You remember Felix and his wife Drusilla, they want to hear from Paul concerning the faith in Christ, and Felix was actually close to making a decision about that. You remember when Paul was sharing those elements of the gospel to him, he trembled. He was afraid. That's a legitimate response when you realize that you are headed to hell. That's a legitimate response of an unsaved person. But he waits for a more convenient season, and then eventually we saw that he was trying to profit from Paul's imprisonment and said, well, maybe if he bribes me a little bit, I'll let it go. Of course, he knew about the offering that they give, and maybe some of these people who are coming to visit him can raise up a little love offering to get Paul out of prison. That was kind of where his mind went. And so finally, after 2 years, Caesar has Felix replaced by a new governor. He did a horrible job, and there were uprisings and rebellions, and he did a horrible job responding to those. And finally Caesar, it's an imperial province, Judea is, and so Caesar says who comes and who goes, and Felix is not doing a good job, and so Caesar says, you're out, and we'll put a new one in. And that's where we pick up this evening. Porcius Festus is now the new governor, and Felix leaves Paul in prison, and it's kind of to appease the Jews there. Even though he's leaving office, they might pursue him if he did something to let Paul go or free him. And so he's not going to take that chance, and he says, I'll just leave him for the new governor. We'll let him deal with it. It won't be my problem anymore. And so here we see Paul with the new governor, Festus, in Acts 25. 1 through 7, we'll just get to the beginning of it this evening. But Acts 25:1 says, Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul, and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me, and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. And so here we're actually in the middle of the trials of Paul and his imprisonment. 2 years here. He'll spend another 2 years in Rome. So this is kind of the midpoint here at this point. But it's a lengthy discourse on these events because it stems from Acts chapter 21 all the way through Acts 28, 8 chapters worth. And so in those 8 chapters, there's very little doctrine given. Now, doctrine's instruction for living. We get doctrine from Scripture, among other things. And so there's very little doctrine in these verses. It's more of a historical account. Paul does present the gospel over and over again. He does do that every opportunity. But he isn't seeing people saved like he had been in other places. You remember on his missionary journeys, he goes into a new city, he goes into the synagogue if they have one. If not, he'll go and find others, and he'll start presenting the gospel. He sees people saved, and then the Jews realize that's happening. They try to run him out of town, and so he is seeing people saved over and over again, even though he's getting chased out of a lot of these places. And so here, we haven't seen anybody get saved in this. And as far as we can tell, we won't. We won't there. And so he's obviously been discouraged because Jesus appeared to him when he was there at Jerusalem under arrest to cheer him up. And so this is kind of going to be a 4-year span that seems like Paul's failure in ministry. It's like everything's going wrong. He's not starting any new churches. He's not seeing people saved. What's happening here? Right? This isn't the Paul that we've seen in the earlier chapters of Acts. Right? And so it's not a failure, but it seems that way at first. And so, we've already seen God provide protection for Paul through his divine providence. Now, providence just means God orchestrates the events, but he doesn't do anything supernatural. It's just through natural means, and we saw that. The chief captain rescued him from the crowd at Jerusalem. That was just a natural means. And so we also saw that God used Paul's Roman citizenship to protect him. That was just natural means. We're going to see that again coming up in the future there. But he also used, you remember, Paul had a nephew who's likely just 12 or 13 years old. He overheard the plot that they were going to kill Paul when they transported him. And so God used that means, just a boy in the right place at the right time. And so Paul is now being guarded by a Roman centurion with as much liberty really as a prisoner could possibly want. That's how he's living at this time. And we'll see in the future he does get to write some important letters during his imprisonment in Rome. We know those as the prison epistles. And that would include Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. Those are things that he wrote while he's in prison. So he will get to do that, but God's still working in his life. He's just not seeing the same results as he's seen in the past. We need this. We need this 4-year span from Paul's life, right? Because there are times in our own lives where we're praying, we're going to church, we're inviting people to go to church, we're witnessing to people, and we're doing all those things, and you say, why isn't anything happening? Why are we not seeing people saved? Why is it, and this is a good example of that. It's not that God's not working. He is. He's still directing his plan perfectly in Paul's life. And so this new governor, Festus, unlike Felix, is actually a pretty decent ruler in Judea. Not a godly person, but he is a pretty decent ruler. He doesn't rule with the same kind of cruel and lustful things that Felix did while he was ruling. Festus, after he's appointed here, and at this point we don't get the account from Scripture, but he dies 2 years after this. He's appointed to this office, and he only lives 2 years, and then he dies. But Josephus, a historian from that time, he says that Festus was definitely a better governor than Felix was. And the next governor that takes his place is named by a guy by the name of Albinus, and he was better than him too. So, when you sandwich in between two bad guys and you say, well, this guy was a pretty good Joe, even though he didn't last long. And so, but Acts 25, verse 1, another plot to kill Paul. That's what we're seeing here. Acts 25, 1. Now when Festus was come into the province after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now we talk about this all the time. Anytime you go to Jerusalem, you have to go where? Up. You go up because it's up on a mount or a hill there. And so when you leave Jerusalem, you're going down. It's a little different from us, those of us who grew up on the river. When we talk about going up somewhere, you go up to Ashland because that's up river. Or you go down to Portsmouth because that's down river. If you didn't live by the river, if we'd say up, you'd think north. Or down would be south. And so that's not how they described it. They described an elevation change most of the time in Scripture there. So here in verse 1, Festus has only been in office for 3 days. He goes to Caesarea, he gets settled, and he realizes that he needs to go to Jerusalem. Now, it's important for the governor of Judea to have some sort of working relationship with the Jews. If you're going to be the governor of Judea, which is where Jerusalem is and all of those surrounding towns there, you better have a decent, at least a working relationship with the Jews. Why? There's a lot of them, especially in Jerusalem. There are a lot of them that come to Jerusalem from other parts of the world during the feast days. And so if this guy doesn't have some kind of working relationship with them, they can cause a lot of problems for him, especially with Caesar. And like I said, Caesar appoints this person. He can remove him at any time. It's not an elected office. Right? It's just this one's in, that one's out. It's that simple. And so if they cause too much flack, that's what he'll do. And so you remember that's how the Jews blackmailed Pilate. Right? That's how they used it. Right? Oh, if you let this guy live, you're not a friend of Caesar's. Right? They had already complained about Pilate way before Jesus came on the scene. And so this was just strike after strike after strike. And so some of those rulers weren't smart enough to make nice with the Jews, and so they didn't last long in Judea. And that's just how it works there. They did the same thing with Felix, right? Felix was a cruel person and just killed people at will and did those kind of things. And eventually the Jews said, no, we're not going to take that. We know who to talk to about that. And they would make the trek to Rome and talk to Caesar or the Senate about those things. And so we also know in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, 400 years. We call them the 400 silent years. There is history that happened between those two testaments there, between those 400 years. And most of us have probably heard of a guy named Judas Maccabeus, right, or the Maccabees. That happened between those two things. Greece actually had a guy in charge by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, right? That was a title that he gave himself, which meant Antiochus the Great One. Kind of a modest fellow, just that was his title. He was a nut bar, though, a very prideful and arrogant person. Instead of the Jews calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, they called him Antiochus Epimanes, which meant Antiochus the madman. That was the inside joke there. But Judas Maccabeus and his sons started a revolution which was successful. That was the Maccabees there, and they revolted against that government and did have success in that during that time. And so the Jews are definitely capable of stirring up a lot of trouble, causing rebellions and a lot of things like that. And so the rulers from that time, and even when Rome took over, they're a little leery of the Jews when they get together or when they're pushed into a corner or something like that. And it always kind of reminds me of when Tyler was fighting. What was he fighting with? A possum, right? Possums they're not really aggressive kind of creatures. Until you back them in the corner with a stick and poke at them and carry them on, and eventually they'll bite. I mean, he had to get the tetanus shots and all that after doing that. And that's kind of the way the Jews are. They know they're in subjection to another empire there. At this time it's Rome, and so they're going to go and go and go, but they keep poking them with a stick. Eventually they're going to bite back, and so they know that from history there, and so they know that these people will travel to Rome. They will complain to Caesar, and they will do it over and over again. They will fight at some point if that's necessary there. And so the smart leaders, they tend to try to walk on eggshells around them. They try to tiptoe around and get along, play nice if they can. And so Festus is one of the smart ones. Felix wasn't, but Festus is. And so here in Acts 25:2, he says, "Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him." Now, when Festus comes to Jerusalem, the high priest, and it says the chief of the Jews, now that would be key members of the Sanhedrin Council there, they meet with Festus, the new governor. The first thing they talk about with the new governor is Paul. That's the first order of business. This guy just took office. And you say, of all the things that you want changes or you want improvements in or anything like that, no. No, they said, first order of business, you need to take care of this guy, this prisoner, Paul there. And so for 2 years, the Jews have had this burning hatred for Paul. They're trying to get him killed, right? And you see here, this new guy, this new governor, he wants their favor, right? He wants to get along. He wants to play nice. He's coming in. And so they see this as a prime opportunity to get Paul taken care of. That's what they're trying to do. And so since their attempts at a conviction by trial have been an utter failure so far, they're just going back to their original attempts at Paul's life, and that's an assassination. And so they said, just bring him up to Jerusalem and we'll have a trial, right? And they've got the same plot there. In verse 3 it says, "And desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him." Now, the new governor, he's green. He's been here a few days. That's how long he's been in office. Right? He probably doesn't know about the assassination attempt 2 years before this, when the chief captain has to send 470 soldiers with Paul, escort him out of Jerusalem, send him down to Caesarea by night. He probably has no idea, the new governor has no idea that those things happened there and those plots. And so maybe this time they see any young men running around that ain't supposed to be there, they won't make the plot known to them like the nephew heard the first time. They'll keep that a little more tight-lipped and among a certain group, and they're going to get it done. We'll just get him transported. This guy won't know to have the heavy security on him, and we'll assassinate him. So it says there, they desired favor. They want a favor. They're not seeking justice. All they need is for Paul to come to Jerusalem. They'll take care of the rest. And so this really is the hatred of religious people toward Christianity. Now, if these Jews were godly people, there wouldn't be this continuing hatred. This wouldn't be these thoughts of murder. Those things shouldn't be in the heart of a true believer. And so they're trapped in false religion. How do we deal with false religion? How do we deal with people that we know don't know the truth? They don't accept Jesus as God. They don't accept that's the only way of salvation. How do we deal with them, those kind of people? Just the truth. That's all we can do, is offer them the truth. Right? Warn them that this is the only way to be saved. Right? How are these people dealing with Paul if they think he's in a false religion? It's hatred, it's violence, it's murder. It's all the things that Satan promotes, isn't it? Destruction, death, all of that, right? But it's because they're on his side. That's why that's their motive there. The greatest persecutors of true religion aren't the horribly wicked people, are they? No. No, it's false religion. They're the greatest persecutors. Right? When we think of the worst parts of the world system, right, we might think of things like those who commit heinous crimes or violent things, or maybe things like prostitution or addiction or murderers or whoever, and we might think of those kind of things, and those things are corrupt. They are, and very deceiving, but that's not the pinnacle of Satan's world. The pinnacle of Satan's world is false religion. That's the most deceiving. You don't deceive people with a murderer, do you? Right? I mean, 99.999% of the people realize a murderer is a bad person because of the deed that they've done. They understand that. But you take people and you shine them up all pretty on the outside and make them look good, right? And put them in a false religion. Now those people can be very deceiving, and that's what Satan wants. If you look in Revelation 17:5, you'll see when Satan tries to bring it all together, he's trying to take control of the whole world in the tribulation period. That's what's happening. Right? How does he try to do that? In Revelation 17:5, it begins with a world religion. That's what it begins with. The Antichrist actually signs a treaty with the Jews at the beginning of that, and that religious system begins there. In Revelation 17:5, you can see the church is portrayed as what? We are the what of Christ? The bride of Christ. That's what the church is. The false religious system during the tribulation period that the Antichrist is promoting isn't pictured as a bride. He's pictured as a prostitute, as a harlot. Here in Revelation 17:5, it's described as the mother of harlots. He says, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And so that religion's not the bride of Christ. It's the fake. That's the religious system that Satan has in place for the world. In verse 3 there, if you back up, you see she's riding on the beast there. She's carried along by the Antichrist. He's promoting that for a time. And you remember eventually the Antichrist decides religion and government don't have to be separate. Right? I can be the one world ruler and everybody can worship me. That's what it comes to in the midpoint. And so that religious system then becomes unnecessary. And he has that destroyed by the 10 kings that are ruling under him. There in verse 16, if you want to read that, Revelation 17, he says, and the 10 horns, that's the 10 kings, which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. And so that's what happens. They just say, we don't need the religious system anymore. The Antichrist will be the religious system there, and she's unnecessary there. And so in John 15:18, there are all kinds of other corruptions and deceptions going on, by the way, at that time during the tribulation, but false religion is the pinnacle of them all. John 15:18, Jesus talking here, he says, John 15:18, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Now, what part of the world hated Jesus? Was it the people that claimed to be atheists? Are those the people that hated Jesus? No. Was it the most open sinners of that day? Was it the prostitutes and the harlots and those kind of people, drunkards, publicans? No, wasn't those kind of people. Was it the demon-possessed people? Those were some wild characters, weren't they? Were those the people that persecuted Jesus? No. All of those groups of people, if they didn't want to change, they didn't want to accept Christ, what did they do with Christ? they just avoided him, didn't they? They just stayed away from him as much as possible. That's what they did there. But those who continued to pursue him in hatred, who was that? The Jews, the Judaizers. That false religion, those who rejected Christ as the Messiah. That's the group that pursued him, hated him, had him killed there. They were pretending to worship God in false religion. So if the world hates us because we're a lousy person, well, that's different. We can fix that, can't we? Yeah, if you're a lousy person, you need to work on that. Just be a better person to fix some things there. But if the world hates us because they're trying to avoid us and we keep pursuing them with the gospel, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Yeah, that's a good thing. If the world hates us because we're sharing the truth and they're trying to promote a false religion, that's a good thing too there. So all of those false religious systems don't know God because they don't know Christ. That's what's happening. So here we see, though, sin enslaves a person. Sin enslaves a person. We see from these accounts, like I said, from Acts 21 to Acts 28, Paul's a prisoner. He's already here in the middle. He's been under arrest for 2 years. What's he been doing all this time? Well, he's been preaching, sharing the gospel. He's been fellowshipping with other Christians during this time. He's allowed to have visitors. Anybody can come and go as they want. He's enjoying free meals, isn't he? Right? This place was originally the palace. The praetorium was the palace. And so he's staying in this not too shabby accommodations. They're feeding him all the time. He's enjoying the protection of the Roman military. He's got a centurion assigned to him the whole time. But he can't leave. And he's enjoying a lot of freedom. He is. The Jews, though, that are supposedly absolutely free by the world standard, they can come and go as they please. They don't have to stay in one place like Paul does. But they can't let this go. They can't. It keeps eating at them. It keeps their mind captive. We were talking the other night about and sometimes you can't sleep and things like that, and your mind goes and you can't shut it off, right? Your mind just keeps you captive. It's a miserable thing there. And so that's what they just keep going back to Paul. If we could just get rid of this guy. And that's what they're thinking about all the time. It keeps them anxious, it keeps them bitter, it keeps them jealous, it keeps them hateful, right? Which begs the question, who's really bound? Is Paul having those kind of feelings? No. Who's really bound by their own sin? It's the Jews. It's the Jews, and they're enslaved by it. Paul has been free to love all, right? Even those who are trapped in their own hatred, right? But they're not free. They're not. Romans 6:16. We know this verse. He says, Romans 6:16, know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. So, by the way, God's people aren't immune to the trappings of things like hatred or bitterness or jealousy. Right? Saul, the first king of Israel, is an example of that. Right? He wasted much of his life pursuing his hatred of David, trying to have him killed. He wasted that. And so back in Acts 25 verse 4, this is an interesting response. The Jews want a favor, right? He wants to get along with them. They want to get along with him, supposedly. We just need one little favor, right? Just one. And they ask to have Paul transported to Jerusalem. And here's his response. Now, that seems like an innocent request. Verse 4 says, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Now, Caesarea is the primary place where the governor would reside. He has a place in Jerusalem. So it's not like when he goes to Jerusalem, he has to stay in an inn or a guest chamber or something. He has a place there too. There are homes for him in either place there. But he'd rather be in Caesarea if possible. Now why? Well, Caesarea is a Gentile city. Jerusalem is a what? Jewish city. So the Gentile Roman governor would rather be in the Gentile city than in Jerusalem. So Caesarea is where he'd be most comfortable with the Gentile people, and that's where he'd prefer. But it's not that he suspects some kind of conspiracy against Paul's life. It's just that's where he'd rather be. It's going to be inconvenient for him to transport him up here anyway, so let's just go down there and have the trial. Now Acts 25:5 says, "Let them therefore," said he, "which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him." And he says, no. We're all going to go down to Caesarea. That's where we'll take care of this and we'll hear the case. Now, for a person who's trying to gain favor with the Jews, he doesn't seem to be trying very hard. That's a little uncharacteristic for them to ask for one favor and he denies their one request. Now, by human logic, most people would say, just throw him a bone. Just bring the guy up there, have the trial at Jerusalem, get it over with. But by the providence of God, for some reason, he doesn't. Festus offers an alternative. Now, God has ordained this person, Festus, to have this position at this particular time because he knows that's what Festus will choose to do. There's no swaying of it. It's really unnatural for him to choose that, but God puts him there because he knows he will choose that. Daniel 4 is a wonderful example of that, how God places people in certain positions at certain times, and God controls all of those things. And if you're anxious about people in leadership or politics or whatever that may be, your boss at work or whoever it is, these are good verses to know. So we'll look at a few of them because God says this over and over and over again in Daniel chapter 4. Now this is dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, we know that, but Daniel chapter 4:17, he says, "This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." The Most High, that's who? God. That's God. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men. He decides who rules and when. And sometimes, as you see at the end of that verse, it's the basest of men. Sometimes it's some pretty low characters, isn't it? Some people that we think, there ain't no way God would choose that person. And there are some wicked people, but God wants us to understand that principle. Skip down to verse 25, you see it again. "That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will." It says, you need to understand, God's the one picking these people. God will put them in. God will take them out. Right? You really don't have any say in it. Verse 32, again he says, "And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, that they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will." Verse 35. He says, "And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou?" Now, we may question God's choices. That's what he's saying at the end of the verse, right? We can say, "What are you doing?" We can question that. But we're not going to stay his hand. We're not going to stop it. We're not going to change it there. He is going to put who he wants in those positions. Now, we can get all tore up about who's in office now, whether that be politics or who's in position as your boss or who's in whatever kind of leadership role. You can get all bent out of shape about that, and you can worry and you can fret and you can do that and say, well, maybe we'll get a better one next time, and maybe, and you can worry about that all you want to, and it won't change one thing. God is going to pick who He wants to rule in those positions. Right? And I know we have a wonderful freedom to be able to exercise, to vote in our country. Right? If you choose to do that, that's wonderful. Do that. Right? I don't. Right? I don't. But I don't complain about the ones that I put in either. I feel like if I don't do my justice and do my duty and vote and participate, then I don't have any right to gripe about it. So I don't. Right? But God is going to put who He wants in those positions. Right? He's going to do that, either for our good or for our judgment. Right? He's going to pick them. Verse 5, he says in Acts 25:5. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. Now Festus says to those who are able to come down. Now that's an interesting word. It's dunatos. It means the powerful or the capable. If you say those who are able, sometimes we might think, well, these are the people that could get off work, or these are the people that could travel, or whatever it is. That's not at all what he's saying here. He's telling them to send the powerful or the capable. Send the best ones, right? The most able ones down. Representatives, the best that they have. It's kind of like if we were to go in an act of war, I hope we don't, but if we do, right, we would send able men and women there. Now when we say able, we don't mean just the people who can shoot a gun. Right? Me and Joe and Dwayne, we could shoot a gun too. Some of you women I know can shoot guns too. Lori, I know you can shoot a gun. You hunt all the time, don't you? Yeah. But they're not going to send us, right? Why not? We're not our knees hurt. If we got down in a hole, we couldn't get back up. No, they wouldn't send us because we're not the most powerful. We're not the most capable, right? Just because we're able doesn't mean we're the able-bodied ones that they'd send. That's the same kind of picture he's sending here. He's not just saying send whoever can come. He's saying send the best representatives from the Sanhedrin down here to present their side of this case there. And so that's what they're going to do. And they can sort this out. Verse 6 there, and we'll close with this. He says, and when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. Now he spends 10 days. He was 3 days in Caesarea. He comes up to Jerusalem to try to make nice with the Jews, and he's there 10 days after he talks to the high priest and some of the Sanhedrin there. And so he gives them ample time to kind of prepare for the trial. 10 days there, they're going to go back to Caesarea, and so they can get their witnesses together, they can get their information together, they can get the best representatives they have, they can prepare for the journey, and they can all go down there and sort this out at Caesarea. And so they're going to present the same accusations, by the way, that they did back in Acts 24:5. Those accusations were unfounded back in Acts 24:5. They're going to be the exact same accusations here before Festus. And Paul's going to respond to that, and we'll see that next time. Any questions this evening?